Have you ever noticed that even after achieving something you once desperately wanted, there can still be a quiet emptiness inside you? You reach the goal. You overcome the struggle. You learn how to heal old wounds. You become more aware of yourself. And yet, somewhere deep inside, there is still this strange feeling that something is missing. You may look fine on the outside, but ordinary life can still shake you. One difficult conversation can disturb your peace. One rejection can make you question your worth. An unexpected failure can bring back emotions you thought you had already healed. So what if healing was never supposed to mean becoming completely untouched by life? What if there was a deeper stage of transformation that most people never reach because they stop searching too soon? Carl Jung spent much of his life studying the unconscious mind, dreams, symbols, and the hidden forces that shape human behavior. One of the most fascinating ideas connected to his work is the concept of becoming a whole person, not a perfect person, but a person who has stopped running from different parts of themselves. Jung believed that real psychological growth is not about creating a flawless version of yourself. It is about becoming conscious of who you actually are, and that journey can be understood through three powerful symbolic stages borrowed from the ancient tradition of alchemy: Negredo, Albedo, and Rubedo. These were originally associated with stages of transformation, but Jung saw a deeper psychological meaning in them. Negredo represents the breakdown of an old psychological structure. It can feel like darkness, confusion, uncertainty, or the loss of meaning. Imagine spending 20 years building a life around a certain identity. Maybe you built your career around it. Maybe your family expected you to become that person. Maybe you spent years proving yourself through achievement. Then one day something changes. The job is still there. The responsibilities are still there. The people around you are still there. But something inside you no longer responds the same way. The things that once excited you suddenly feel empty. The goals that once gave you direction no longer seem important. And you may begin wondering, what's wrong with me? But perhaps nothing is wrong. Perhaps an old version of you has simply reached the end of its usefulness. That can be frightening because humans naturally want stability. We want to know who we are, where we're going, and what comes next. When those answers disappear, the mind often interprets uncertainty as failure. But transformation rarely begins with certainty. Sometimes it begins when certainty disappears. This is the territory of Negredo. It is the moment when the old structure begins to fall apart, creating space for something deeper to emerge. Eventually, another stage can begin. Albedo represents greater clarity. You start looking at your thoughts and emotions from a different perspective. Instead of immediately reacting to anger, you become curious about where it came from. Instead of allowing fear to control every decision, you begin observing it. Instead of believing every thought your mind produces, you start recognizing that thoughts are experiences, not absolute truths. Life may begin to feel calmer, and this is where another trap can appear. You might think you've finally figured everything out. You feel peaceful. You feel lighter. You understand yourself better. So you decide the journey is over. But Jung's perspective suggests that peace is not necessarily the final destination. There is another level of integration. Rubedo can be understood as the symbolic stage of wholeness. Not perfection, wholeness. There is a huge difference between the two. Perfection says, I need to eliminate everything about myself that I don't like. Wholeness says, I need to understand every part of myself. A whole person can recognize their strengths without becoming arrogant. They can recognize their weaknesses without becoming ashamed. They can experience anger without allowing anger to define them. They can experience fear without allowing fear to control every decision. They can experience sadness without believing that sadness is their entire identity. Rubedo in this sense is not about escaping ordinary life. It is about returning to ordinary life with a different relationship to yourself. You still work. You still have responsibilities. You still deal with difficult people. You still experience disappointment. You still make mistakes. But you no longer need every external circumstance to be perfect. Before you can feel internally grounded. Think about two people standing in the middle of a storm. Both experience the same wind. Both feel the same rain. Both face the same uncertainty. But one person fights desperately against everything happening around them, while the other has learned how to remain centered even when circumstances are unpredictable. The difference isn't necessarily the storm. The difference is their relationship with the storm. That's what makes this transformation so powerful. It doesn't turn you into someone who never suffers. It teaches you how to stop fighting against the fact that suffering is sometimes part of being human. Most people don't reach this kind of integration because they stop at the first comfortable place they find. Some people become overwhelmed when their old identity begins falling apart, so they immediately return to familiar habits. Others discover peace and then become attached to that peaceful feeling. But real growth requires something more uncomfortable. It requires continuing to look inward, even after the immediate crisis has passed. There are several psychological shifts that can happen along this journey. The first begins when your inner energy starts moving away from the old version of yourself. For years, you may have been deeply invested in a certain role. Maybe you were the successful person. Maybe you were the responsible one. Maybe you were the person everyone depended on. Maybe you were constantly trying to prove that you were good enough. Your identity became connected to that role. And because so much of your mental energy was invested in maintaining it, you naturally felt driven by it. But eventually, that energy can begin to withdraw. Suddenly, something that once seemed incredibly important feels strangely distant. You might still perform your responsibilities, but the emotional connection isn't the same. You may even feel guilty about it. You may tell yourself, I should be more motivated. I should work harder. I should be grateful. I should want this. But forcing yourself to feel something that has naturally faded rarely solves the deeper problem. Sometimes the loss of motivation is actually an invitation to question what your life has been built around. Imagine the ocean pulling away from the shore. For a moment, it can look like the water is disappearing. But the retreat of the water doesn't mean the ocean has lost its power. It may simply be part of a larger movement. Your inner life can work the same way. When psychological energy withdraws from an old identity, the emptiness can feel uncomfortable. But that emptiness creates space. And what enters that space next can completely change the direction of your life. This is where the shadow often begins to emerge. The shadow is made up of the parts of ourselves we don't want to identify with. The anger we consider unacceptable. The insecurity we try to hide. The jealousy we don't want to admit. The need for approval. The fear of being rejected. The vulnerability we learn to disguise as strength. We often believe that if we ignore these parts, they'll eventually disappear. But they don't disappear. They simply find other ways to express themselves. Maybe someone says something completely ordinary, and you suddenly become extremely irritated. Maybe a friend succeeds, and instead of feeling happy for them, something inside you feels threatened. Maybe someone criticizes you, and your reaction is far stronger than the situation actually requires. These moments can reveal something important. Not necessarily about the other person, but about you. The question becomes, why did this affect me so deeply? That question can be uncomfortable, but it can also become one of the most valuable questions you ever ask yourself. Because the goal isn't to blame yourself. The goal is awareness. When you become conscious of your shadow, you stop giving unconscious emotions complete control over your behavior. You begin recognizing the difference between what happened and how you interpreted what happened. And that difference can change everything. You may discover that some of the things you criticize most strongly in others are connected to qualities you have never allowed yourself to accept. That doesn't mean every criticism is projection. It doesn't mean harmful behavior should be tolerated. It simply means that your emotional reaction deserves to be understood. This is where self-awareness becomes deeper than simply saying positive things about yourself. Real self-awareness requires honesty. You have to be willing to see the parts of yourself that don't fit your preferred image, the compassionate side, the selfish side, the confident side, the insecure side, the patient side, the angry side, the generous side, the fearful side. All of these can exist within the same human being. Wholeness doesn't mean choosing only the parts you like. It means becoming conscious of the entire picture. And once you begin seeing your shadow, another major transformation can occur. The ego begins losing its position as the absolute authority over your life. The ego is not your enemy. In fact, a healthy ego is necessary. It helps you function in the world. It gives you a sense of identity. It helps you make decisions, set boundaries, build relationships, and pursue goals. The problem begins when the ego believes it must control everything. When your entire life becomes an attempt to protect an image, you begin asking questions like, how will people see me? Will they respect me? Will they think I'm successful? Am I impressive enough? Did I say the right thing? Did I make myself look weak? At that point, life can become exhausting. You aren't simply living anymore. You're constantly managing an image of yourself. Every compliment gives you temporary relief. Every criticism feels like a threat. Every failure feels like proof that you're not good enough. And slowly your life becomes a performance. Jung's deeper message was that psychological maturity involves developing a relationship with the ego rather than allowing the ego to dominate the entire personality. The ego can drive the car, but it doesn't need to believe that it owns the entire road. As you become more conscious, you begin to understand that your identity is larger than your achievements. You are larger than your job. You are larger than other people's opinions. You are larger than your mistakes. You are even larger than the story you have been telling yourself about who you are. This is where real inner freedom begins. You no longer need to destroy yourself every time you discover something imperfect. You no longer need to pretend that you're always confident. You no longer need to hide every uncomfortable emotion. You can look at yourself honestly and still remain on your own side. And perhaps that is one of the deepest meanings of becoming whole. Not becoming someone else. Not becoming perfect. Not escaping the human experience. But finally becoming willing to meet yourself exactly where you are. The person who reaches this point doesn't necessarily have fewer problems.